20 years is a long time, until you realize it's also a deadline. In Chiang Mai, in August 2000, Kirsty Jones was raped and murdered in a guest house room. The case didn't just become a hunt for a person. It became a race against a clock that never stops. Just stay with me, because the ending isn't a twist. It's a limit. This episode contains discussion of sexual violence and homicide. What you're about to hear is reconstructed from documented reporting and official public records, including parliamentary remarks made in the UK about investigative issues and DNA-related developments. Some accounts conflict on smaller details, and where the record is uncertain, I'll say that plainly. A clearly labelled speculation lane appears later, separate from the verified timeline and not presented as fact. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Kirsty Jones wasn't a headline in her own life. She was a 23-year-old who'd done the work, finished university, and wanted one more stretch of sky before adulthood closed in. Before the job, the routine, the settling down she talked about back home. She grew up near Brecon in Wales, in Tredeman, the kind of place where your name isn't just yours. It belongs to your family, your neighbours, the land you can point to without thinking. People who spoke about her publicly, especially her mother, kept coming back to the same picture. Bright, intelligent, independent, not reckless, not asking for it. Just a young woman with confidence and curiosity. The kind that makes travel feel like a natural extension of who you already are. By May 2000, she left home for a solo backpacking trip around the world. Most reporting places, her moving through Malaysia and Singapore, before reaching northern Thailand in early August. The trip wasn't framed as escape. It was framed as a last big breath, something she'd promised herself before building the next chapter. Chiang Mai is one of those places that can feel gentle on the surface. Temples, guest houses, markets, and easy conversations with strangers who become friends for a week. Kirsty checked into Aree Guesthouse, a well-known backpacker stop near the Old City area. The kind of place where travellers cross paths in hallways and common spaces, where you can be alone without feeling isolated. In the days before her death, a parliamentary account later said she joined a 3-day trek in the mountain region of Chiang Mai province. Exactly the kind of experience backpackers chase because it feels authentic and close to the land. That same account notes the guides were described as coming from local hill tribe communities. One guide was identified in the debate as Narong. I'm not making an accusation here. I'm telling you what was said on the official record in the UK years later. Now, this matters, because the everyday details are what keep her human. Buying small gifts for family, chatting with people you just met, moving through a city at night with the simple assumption that you'll be back in your room soon. In that same parliamentary debate, it was said that on the evening of August 9th, 2000, she was out drinking with people she'd met in Chiang Mai, and around 11 p.m., she went to the night market to pick up presents for her family, alone. Around midnight, she returned to Aree. A British inquest summary reported in the press later put it this way. She came back to the guest house at about midnight, and she was attacked quickly, almost as soon as she returned. An autopsy was reported as placing time of death around 1 a.m. And here's one of those awful details that changes the whole emotional temperature of a story. She wasn't found right away. Reporting doesn't line up cleanly on the exact discovery time on August 10th. Some accounts place it earlier, some later. Either way, the gap matters. The world keeps moving. People keep walking past the door. And inside that room, everything has already ended. Across credible reporting and official remarks, the core facts are consistent. She was raped and strangled in her room at Aree Guesthouse in Chiang Mai. Those are brutal words, but we don't get to soften them just because they hurt to say out loud. The aftermath, before we even get to suspects or procedural questions, turns her from traveller into daughter in the most violent way possible. News coverage of her funeral in Wales described a packed church, hundreds of mourners, and a service that pulled people from around Britain to a small village near where she grew up. A local canon spoke about the graduation photo that had circulated after her death. Those bright shining eyes, a young woman ready to make her mark. 2 university friends gave tributes during the service. That's the part a lot of true crime coverage skips. The fact that she had people who knew her voice, her humor, her presence, people who had to stand up in a church and describe her in the past tense. And her mother, Sue, keeps showing up in the public record as the person who refused to let the story become just another unsolved file in a foreign country. Years later, as the 20-year legal deadline approached, she said the early hope and prayer, gave way to losing faith in how the case was handled in Thailand, and she spoke openly about how alone it can feel when attention fades. Whether you agree with every part of that, you can hear the shape of it. A mother living in 2 realities at once. Kirsty as a living person in her memory, and Kirsty as a victim in a system that keeps stalling out. There's one more human detail I want you to sit with, because it's not a case fact, it's a grief fact. In a letter later published publicly, her mother described how anniversaries hit like a wave, how August 10th doesn't pass like a normal day, how it drags everything back, the good memories and the ones you wish you could unsee. She included a poem about missing Kirsty's laugh, her voice, her presence. Ordinary mother-daughter things that become unbearable when they're gone. I'm not quoting it at length because it's private pain made public, but its meaning is simple. The world moved on, and Sue didn't get the option to. And this is where the story changes shape, because once you've said her name out loud and you can actually picture her, once she's a real person again, not a case file, the next part gets harder to listen to. Not because it's graphic, but because it's procedural. It's the point where a life becomes evidence, and every decision after that either protects the truth or lets it slip away. From here on, what matters isn't only what happened in that room. It's what happened after, who got questioned, what got collected, how it got handled, and how quickly the story hardened into something the system couldn't or wouldn't untangle. What happens next is the part that sounds like progress when you read it fast. Detentions, interrogations, confident statements to the press. But when you slow down, it's a case trying to find its footing while the ground keeps shifting under it. In the first days after Kirsty was found, Thai police signaled, publicly, that they believed they were close, that DNA would confirm suspicions. It's the kind of thing that can feel reassuring to a family thousands of miles away. They know who did it. They just need the science to lock it down. But within roughly the first couple of weeks, that storyline took a hit. Reporting at the time described a group of foreign travelers who were suspected early on, then later cleared by DNA testing. That matters for 2 reasons. First, because it shows the investigation moved quickly into find a suspect mode. And second, because once DNA starts excluding people, it forces the case into a harder kind of work, identifying a profile rather than matching a hunch. Very early on, some reporting described police focus on the guest house owner. alongside public suggestions that DNA would confirm it. When DNA later excluded that direction, the case didn't just lose a suspect, it lost time, and it lost trust. And you can feel the tension right there early. Police focus, then reversal. Headlines that flare up, then collapse. It's not just frustrating. In a case like this, where the eventual story becomes, "We ran out of legal runway," every early detour has a cost. The DNA becomes the spine of the case. Not just, "We have DNA," but the more specific, less cinematic truth. Biological material recovered from the scene produced a profile that investigators believed belonged to the perpetrator, and analysis pointed away from the first wave of foreign suspects. Later, in the UK record, the DNA is described as indicating a Southeast Asian origin. That detail is important because it's the moment the investigation should have snapped into a different strategy. Less, round up the obvious outsiders. More, how do you identify one person in a dense city when all you have is a profile and a shrinking window? But strategy is where this case keeps getting complicated. Years later, the UK record describes what the Welsh police said they were dealing with: the limits of access and control when your citizen is killed overseas. Dyfed-Powys Police pushed to reopen the case on the UK side, and Thai police brought exhibits to the UK so the Forensic Science Service could examine them. A full DNA profile was developed, and it became the most interesting line of inquiry, because it was one of the only things that felt objective in a case that had already produced so much noise. Even that objective lane had real-world constraints. A DNA profile is only as good as your ability to compare it. That means databases. That means screening. That means collecting samples from the right pools of people, quickly, while memories are fresh and movement patterns can still be traced. In the parliamentary record, you can hear the frustration, requests for access to original witness statements, efforts to push the Thai side toward a structured DNA screening approach, repeated attempts to keep momentum going. And underneath all of it is the quiet truth nobody wants to say out loud. When you don't control the ground investigation, you can't force the next step. So the case keeps cycling through phases. There are moments where Thai authorities announce renewed DNA pushes, checking against international databases, comparing profiles, revisiting old leads. Years later, there are additional public notes about cross-border coordination, UK detectives travelling to Thailand to meet Thai authorities, mentions of Interpol support, the sense of an investigation that never fully dies, but also never fully catches fire again. And then there's the public controversy that clings to this case like humidity. From very early on, criticism appears in reporting, complaints about investigative competence, and allegations around treatment of suspects. This is the part I want to be careful with, because it's easy for a podcast to turn that into a broad stereotype about how things are in Thailand. That's lazy, and it doesn't help Kirsty. What matters here is narrower. Public reporting described intense pressure on police to deliver answers, and the investigation taking turns that, in hindsight, look like scapegoating. Chiang Mai city life later framed parts of the early period explicitly in that language. Who gets blamed first and why? One thread that keeps resurfacing, because it's so surreal it almost doesn't sound real, is an episode of claims and counterclaims around evidence integrity, suggestions, reported at the time, that evidence could have been planted. Whether you believe any part of that or not, the impact is the same. It muddies the water. It gives everyone, investigators, critics, armchair detectives, future suspects, more room to argue that nothing is solid. And once a case becomes an argument about the case, instead of an argument about the person who did it, time starts leaking out of every seam. Meanwhile, Kirsty's family is living through the long version of this. Not the first week horror, something worse, in a different way. The extended uncertainty. Hope gets stretched thin. Every headline can feel like a door opening, and every fade out feels like it's slamming again. Her mother speaks publicly over the years with a kind of controlled exhaustion. Still pushing, still asking, but carrying the knowledge that unsolved isn't a single outcome. It's a daily condition. By the time you get into the 2000s, you're looking at an investigation that is essentially a DNA identity problem, with international coordination hurdles and a shrinking timeline. There are updates about comparing the killer's profile to databases worldwide. There are meetings, there are renewed calls, but there's no public resolution, no named perpetrator successfully prosecuted, no courtroom where the story can finally be said start to finish under oath, with consequences. And that's the pivot I want you to feel before we move any further. This isn't just a cold case. It's a case where the law itself is a countdown clock. Every year that passes without a charge isn't neutral. It's the door narrowing. And when the deadline gets close, you see what it does to everyone involved: police, diplomats, investigators, family. Because suddenly the question stops being who did it and becomes something darker. If someone figured it out tomorrow, could it even matter in court? And here's the part that feels unreal. Even when you know it's coming, the law gets its own ending. In Thailand, reporting on this case and the UK parliamentary record refer to prescription time limits, what most people call statutes of limitations. Here, that window is described as 20 years, meaning the ability to prosecute had an expiration date. That's not a metaphor. It's a deadline on paper. So for Kirsty, killed in the early hours of August 10th, 2000, the legal runway narrows down to a single date on a calendar in August 2020. And that date doesn't care about grief or effort or how close someone thinks they are. It doesn't care that a DNA profile exists. It doesn't care that her mother kept pushing for 2 decades. The calendar flips and the options change. By the time that deadline is in sight, the reporting shifts tone. It stops sounding like an ongoing investigation and starts sounding like a last sprint. In 2020, outlets in the UK describe it plainly. The family had days left before Thai police would close the case because the 20-year limit was about to expire. British detectives were reported as travelling to Chiang Mai to assist before the deadline hit. That's what race against time looks like when it's not a metaphor. And here's the brutal irony. The closer you get to the deadline, the more you want the system to move faster. But systems don't sprint well. They do what they do. Meetings, requests, reviews, more comparisons, more "we are still working." And then, inevitably, the day arrives. In August 2020, reporting says the investigation was closed when the statute of limitations expired. The way it's described is the part that lands like a punch. Even if the killer were identified after that point, prosecution in Thailand for this crime would no longer be available because the time limit had elapsed. That's the moment the story stops being a whodunit and becomes something colder. A case that can remain unsolved forever, but also unprosecutable. Now, when you step back, you realize this ending didn't just appear in 2020. It was baked in from the start. Every lost hour early on mattered more than anyone wanted to admit at the time. Because this case wasn't no evidence. It was evidence that needs infrastructure. The UK parliamentary debate in 2007 lays out the most concrete version of that. Exhibits were brought to the UK for forensic examination. A full DNA profile was developed. It was stated there that the DNA's origin appeared Southeast Asian, and that DNA became the most compelling line of inquiry. That sounds like a path, but it's also a trap, because a DNA profile is only a door if it connects to a person. If it doesn't, it becomes a hallway. You can walk down for years without ever reaching the end. So you get this long middle stretch, years where the family is living with hope that never quite becomes proof. And when Sue Jones speaks publicly, it's not performative. It's not sensational. It's a mother trying to keep a case alive in a world that gets bored fast. She pushed the UK government to stay engaged. She returned to Thailand more than once. She attached Kirsty's name to the kind of public pressure that can be uncomfortable but necessary. In 2013, even the Bangkok Post reported on her seeking help accessing the investigative files and aligning with other families calling for more transparency and accountability. That's a very specific form of grief, turning your private loss into a public fight, because the alternative is silence. And then, in 2020, the fight hits a wall that isn't emotional, it's legal. This is where I want to talk to you, like we're sitting across from each other, because it's easy to misunderstand what closed means. Closed doesn't mean solved. It doesn't mean they know who did it. In this case, the public reporting is consistent. No one was successfully prosecuted. The killer was not publicly identified. The family was left with the same central wound, just with fewer legal options attached to it. So what's left after the deadline is the record and the memory, and the fact that a name still matters, even when the courts can't touch the case anymore. Documented reporting, official remarks, forensic references, and the repeated effort to make a person connect to a profile. What's left is the fact that Kirsty still has a name that people remember in Wales and in Chiang Mai, and in the traveling world that heard this story and never quite shook it. Chiang Mai city life has treated it as something the city still carries, an unresolved violent death that sits in the background of the backpacker narrative year after year. And what's left is the question that doesn't have a clean answer. If you can't prosecute, what does justice look like? For some families, it becomes truth, official acknowledgement of what happened and how the investigation unfolded. For others, it becomes accountability in a different lane, institutional reform, so another family doesn't hit the same wall. And sometimes, it becomes the smallest thing that still matters, someone, somewhere, finally calling in a real tip that becomes a name, even if that name never sees a courtroom. I'm not going to pretend that's satisfying. It's not. This is one of those stories where the ending is simply a boundary. And if you want the sharpest takeaway, if you want the part you can hold on to without turning away, it's this. Kirsty's story proves that time is evidence too. Time can protect a killer. Time can erode a case. Time can turn a living investigation into a historical question. And sometimes, time doesn't just make justice harder. Sometimes time makes justice impossible. Now I need to separate what's documented from what people say online, because this case has its own fog. This is the speculation lane, and none of it is presented as fact. All right. The first claim is the one people repeat because it feels like closure. They knew who it was, that officials had a name and held it back, that there was certainty somewhere, kept just out of view. It's easy to see why this survives. When a case lives too long, silence starts to feel intentional. But from the outside, silence isn't evidence. It's just silence. Another story that keeps circulating is about scapegoats. That in the first rush, when tourists were scared, when the city was embarrassed, when everyone wanted an answer, foreigners were easy targets. Easy headlines, easy reassurance. You'll see people talk about early detentions like they were the whole case. And when those early suspicions didn't hold, the narrative flips into something permanent. See, it was all a setup. What's true is that the early suspect story shifted. That happened. But online, people take that shift and turn it into a blanket explanation for everything. Every delay, every silence, every dead end. It becomes a conspiracy because a conspiracy feels like action. Then there's the one that poisons the well completely. The evidence was mishandled. The evidence was contaminated. The evidence was planted. That line shows up whenever a case lives too long. It's the perfect weapon because it can't be disproven from a distance, and it makes every future possibility feel pointless. If you believe the evidence is tainted, then no suspect can ever be the suspect. No lead can ever be the lead. The case becomes a loop, and people like loops because loops don't force you to accept the worst thing, that sometimes there isn't a clean explanation. You'll also hear a softer, more intimate assumption dressed up like insight. She let someone in. Maybe she knew him. Maybe she trusted him. Maybe she met him that night. Maybe it was someone she talked to, someone she laughed with, someone who walked her back. It's an easy thing to imagine because it turns the door into the key moment. Like if we understand the door, we understand everything. But there's a danger in that one, because it quietly shifts the weight back onto her. Like the story is about a choice she made, not of violence done to her. And I'm not doing that. Not here. Another popular lane is the transient theory, that it was someone who could move through Chiang Mai like smoke. A worker, a guide, a drifter. Someone tied to tourism, but not rooted anywhere. Someone who could be here for a week and gone the next. People reach for that because it fits the shape of the long problem. A DNA profile without a name. It feels plausible, but plausible is not proven. And here's the point of this lane. This is why I'm even letting it exist in the episode. These stories don't solve anything. They just move the fear around. They give your mind something to hold, a shape, a villain, a reason. And I get it, because the alternative is staring straight at an unsatisfying truth. There's a case with evidence, and a deadline, and a missing name. And the world kept turning anyway. So that's the speculation lane. We name it, we hear it. We don't build our house inside it. Now we step back onto what's documented, and we end where this story actually ends, with Kirsty, with the record, and with the clock that changed what justice could even mean. So that's where this story leaves us. A young woman named Kirsty Jones left home to see the world. She made it to Chiang Mai, and on one night in August 2000, in a guest house room that should have been nothing more than a place to sleep, she was raped and murdered. After that, the case became two things at once: a search for a person and a race against time. And when that clock ran out, the possibility of a prosecution ran out with it. If you're listening to this and you feel frustrated, if you feel that hollow, unfinished weight in your chest, that's a normal response. This is what unresolved looks like when it stretches across decades. The absence becomes its own presence. I want to end by saying her name again, clearly. Kirsty Jones. Because the point of telling this story isn't to sensationalize her death. It's to refuse the erasure that time tries to impose. Sources for this episode include UK Parliament's published debate record, reporting from the BBC, The Guardian, The Bangkok Post, and Chiang Mai City Life, along with additional contemporaneous UK press coverage tied to the inquest and the 2020 deadline reporting. Thank you for listening and for holding space for a story that doesn't hand you a clean ending. If you want to support this show in a quiet way, just follow or subscribe wherever you're listening: Spotify, Apple, Amazon, whatever platform you use, so you don't miss what comes next. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who understands what it means to wait for answers, share it with them. Until next time, this is Shadows of Siam, where the land remembers what others try to forget.